Okay, so far, all the information we have talked about, we've talked about species, natural selection happening to a certain species of organisms, Harding-Weinberg principle, talking about genetic equilibrium within a species. Well, what the heck is a species? Here are 4 different definitions of species. Members of one species interbreed and have a shared gene pool. Gene pool was a vocabulary word from last lecture. All of the genes within a population. So members of one species can interbreed and they have a shared gene pool. Their genes are the same. Each species is reproductively isolated from every other species, meaning if you are a species, you can reproduce with each other and have babies. If you're not a species, you can't reproduce with each other and have babies. So again, each species is reproductively isolated from every other species. Gene flow occurs between the population of a species, but not between the population of a different species. So gene flow, again, is genes going from generation to generation. So gene flow occurs between the populations of one species, but not between different species. 2 species are separate when they are reproductively isolated. Again, 2 species are separate when they are reproductively isolated. They cannot reproduce and have fertile and fit offspring. That's what reproductively isolated means. So when I was talking about the kit fox and the red fox in my last lecture, at one time they were of the same species. They could reproduce, they could have babies. But because of migrations, and they migrated to different environments, different genes were needed for survival, and those are the genes that were passed down from generation to generation. And over time, you try to bring those 2 species together, they cannot reproduce and have fertile and fit offspring, so now they are considered two separate species, and that was the example for divergent evolution. Okay, now I know in one class someone brought this up. Well, what about lions and tigers? They mate, they have babies. Okay, well, there's a lot of other organisms out there that mate and have babies. But because of pre-mating situations, we cannot consider them to be the same species. For example, habitat. Species in the same area may occupy different habitats. Lions are in Africa and tigers are in Asia. They will never meet with each other to have the babies. And the babies they have are unfit. So habitat. So there could be 2 organisms that can reproduce and have fit offspring, but because of habitat, they can't. So that's a pre-mating situation. Pre means before. They never get the chance to mate. If they're not going to have babies, they can't be the same species. Another pre-mating situation is temporal. Temporal means time. The 2 different species reproduce at different times of the year or different times of the day. So there is 2 species of frogs. One reproduces in March and one more in April. If they would reproduce at the same time of the year, they could be considered of the same species, but because they're reproducing at different times of the year, never actually get the chance to mate and have babies, we have to consider them 2 different species. So again, pre-mating situation, they never get the chance to mate. Behavioral. Sometimes animals, if they mated, they could have babies, but because of behavioral differences, they don't. Courtship behavior differs, or the response to different songs, calls, or other signals are going to keep them from mating with each other. Again, a pre-mating situation. Or there's just mechanical errors. Their sex organs are unsuitable for one another. Again, the 4 pre-mating situations, or the 4 situations that keep species separated from each other because they never get the chance to mate, are habitat, temporal, behavioral, and mechanical. But as you know, sometimes organisms do mate and their babies aren't healthy. 2 separate species mate, but things happen. Even though they have mated, even though they have gotten together and maybe tried to have babies, we still cannot consider them of the same species because of post-mating situation. And the first post-mating situation is gamete isolation. The sperm cannot reach or fertilize the egg. If the sperm or pollen cannot get to the egg, they have to be 2 separate species because they're not going to have babies, even though they did have sex. Gamete isolation. And that's going to occur a lot with plants. If pollen cannot get to the egg, if pollen can't grow a pollen tube, the egg's not going to be fertilized, you're not going to have a baby plant. Gamete isolation. Or maybe the two organisms mated, but then they have zygote mortality. A zygote is a fertilized egg. If that fertilized egg dies, you're not going to have a baby. So the fertilized egg dies before it is born. Zygote mortality. Mortality means to die, so it's the death of the fertilized egg. So if two separate species mated and the fertilized egg dies, it's not having babies. You cannot consider them of the same species. Hybrid sterility. So we had two separate species mate, but the baby they produced is unhealthy. Hybrid sterility. Organism survives, but it is sterile. So like the P1 generation, if you have a horse and a donkey mate, or if you have the P1 generation of the lion and tiger mating. And the only times lions and tigers mate is because of humans mating them on purpose, because technically lions and tigers are separate species because of the pre-mating situation known as habitat. But in zoos or wherever, if a lion and tiger mates, it can have a baby, but because of hybrid sterility, they are still two separate species. The baby that is produced is very, very unhealthy. They have a lot of heart problems and they die at a young age. So again, the P1 generation of the horse and the donkey can produce the F1 generation of a mule, and mules are sterile. The P1 generation of the lion and the tiger mating due to humans can produce a liger if it's a male lion, or a tigon if it's a male tiger. And again, they are very unhealthy organisms. So again, lions and tigers are of two different species. Then there's something known as F2 fitness. Every once in a while, that F1 generation does survive and does have babies, but the babies it produces are very, very unhealthy and don't survive very long. So F1 organisms from hybrid sterility is fit. So for some reason that mule maybe now is healthy and the mule can have babies, but when that mule reproduces to get to that F2 generation, the F2 generation is sterile or not healthy at all and does not survive very long. So every once in a while you'll have a mule that is able to have babies, and let's say it reproduced with a horse. It produces something known as a jenny, and the jennies are usually very unhealthy. So maybe by accident or by human intervention, two different species mate, but they're still considered two separate species because of gamete isolation. The egg and sperm cannot get together. Zygote mortality, the fertilized egg dies. Hybrid sterility, the animal that is produced from the two separate species is sick. Or F2 fitness, you have that F1 generation actually being able to have babies, but when it produces babies itself, that F2 generation is very sick. Okay, geographic isolation. Whenever geographic isolation develops between groups of population, speciation has occurred. So we're talking about they were one species, but now over time, because of geographic isolation, they're going to become separate species. Geographic isolation. Geographic refers to land. Isolation means separated, so they're being separated by land. And again, kit fox and red fox. Because of migration, they were separated by land. They were geographically isolated from one another. Speciation just means the forming of a new species. We didn't make one new organism, but what happened is because these one species were now separated from each other, they're adapting to different types of environments. Different genes are needed for them to stay alive. They're going to produce, eventually the new species will be formed. One animal does not turn into a new animal. It's about the animals that are living in the different environments, having sex with each other, producing babies that can survive, and only the survivable genes get passed on from generation to generation. And when you try to bring those organisms together, they can't have babies anymore. So speciation is the forming of a new species. Geographic isolation, like I mentioned, when a population of species becomes isolated by land. When this happens, gene flow stops between the two groups. They're not having sex anymore, so the gene flow is not there. Different mutations are going to happen because one group's adapting to one environment and one group's adapting to different environment, so different genes are needed for survival. And over time, those good genes get passed on, and those are the ones that survive. And it could be different types of genes. The red fox needed the genes for the red coat. The kit fox needed the genes for the brown coat. Different types of genetic drift can take place, or things of Mother Nature, or natural selection occurs. All of those things can happen, which causes reproductive isolation between the two groups. And if reproductive isolation has taken place, then you have speciation. You have new species. One animal didn't suddenly turn into another animal. It's groups of organisms that are separated from each other, adapting to different environments, over time need different traits to survive. And when you try to bring them together, they cannot have babies. The population that become adapted to different habitats will eventually become reproductively isolated because different genes are going to be needed to adapt to those different environments. And over time, genetically, if the genes are different, they're not going to be able to have babies.